Welcome back. Been reading a book lately. The name of the book here, this is just Amazon.com. The book is The Apostle Paul, A Polite Bribe. It is based upon a documentary. I believe the documentary came before the book, but it's this Apostle Paul, A Polite Bribe. It was recommended to me to read, or rather to watch, and I went on Amazon and I couldn't find anywhere where I could just rent the video to watch it, but I did find that there was a book, and the book was just $10, and the DVD, you could buy it for $6, and I figured there'd be more information in the book, so I got it. And the author, Robert Orlando, I thought it was a really good book. He has a similar understanding as to what I do with regards to whether Paul was a member of the early Yeshua movement, the Jewish Christians, or whether he started his own movement. Mr. Orlando seems to agree with my conclusion that Paul started his own movement, but he does seem to be sympathetic to Paul. Like, I think that he thinks that Paul was sincere, and that in some ways, reading the book, you get the impression that I think that Mr. Orlando agrees with Paul's side of the argument, that he thinks that kind of, the church doctrine that that Paul was the only apostle that understand Yeshua's message, that I think Mr. Orlando maybe felt it the same way. I've got several highlights that I made throughout the book as I was reading it, and the first one really deals with that. He is speaking about Paul. This is a subchapter, Paul's central conflict, and it's speaking about what is this conflict that Paul was going through in his letters. And so here at the bottom of the page, in Romans, Paul directed his readers to be renewed by the transforming of your minds. And in return, the conflict reveals those real or perceived obstacles to our goals. For Paul, these obstacles were James and the other apostles, the source of his main conflict. So you can see that the author, he does agree with me that his main conflict was with James and the other apostles. Now, elsewhere in the book, he does seem to indicate that that he thinks that there was another faction within the early assembly, this faction of the circumcision, which was just a small part of the overall group of Jewish Christians. My understanding is that the circumcision was the Jerusalem assembly, that it wasn't a faction within it, that it was the entire assembly. And you can see that in the way that Eusebius mentions James as being the leader of the circumcision, or the bishop of the circumcision, and he goes through these, I think, 18 different bishops of the circumcision. So the circumcision party, in the words of Eusebius, was the actual Jewish Christian groups. It wasn't a faction within them. And then in this other highlighted portion, through the retrospective lens of church doctrine, we conclude that Paul saw a vision on the road to Damascus in order to carry out a divine plan, when in fact it might very well have been subjective experience that originated in his imagination. I am a little bit more cynical than that. I think Paul probably made the whole thing up, if Paul even claimed to have had a vision, because the only source we have for that vision is in Acts. Paul does say that he did see the resurrected Yeshua after all the apostles did, but he doesn't go into detail about it being on the road to Damascus or anything like that, so we don't know if that part of the story is even true. But this is what I think, that when I mentioned that Mr. Orlando seems sympathetic to Paul, or thinks maybe Paul did have the true doctrine, this is kind of what I think maybe he's fallen victim to, or maybe he is objective, and that maybe that's just an incorrect interpretation I got of Mr. Orlando's opinion. But basically the statement, or the central thesis to the book, is that this collection that Paul made that he was bringing to the poor in the Jerusalem, which Mr. Orlando correctly identifies as the Ebionim, the poor itself being another word for the Jerusalem assembly, that this collection for the poor was actually more or less a bribe that he was attempting to pay to James and the other apostles in order to get the right hand of fellowship for it from them so that they would support his mission. And in the same way that I have theorized that Paul went to meet with James and Peter early in his ministry and got the right hand of fellowship, which he mentions in Galatians, that in that meeting, either Paul misinterpreted what they were saying or possibly misled them, and maybe they were not completely understanding what it was Paul was talking about he wanted to teach. And so Paul may have went and presented it as, I want to go and preach to the Gentiles, I want to teach this message about Yeshua. They agreed with him and gave him the right hand of fellowship, and then Paul goes and starts teaching this lawless doctrine that he's making up in the name of Jesus to the Gentiles. And at this point, the other apostles came to investigate what's going on with Paul at Antioch. They sent Kepha there, and then later sent some other messengers from James, and that these Jewish Christians realized that Paul was teaching a false doctrine. That's where Kepha separated himself from Paul's assembly, and that's where the conflict really kind of got heated. And Paul mentions that everyone turned against him, including Barnabas. And I think what happened was Paul was revealed to be a shyster, and from that point, he began to collect this donation, this big amount of money for the poor that he was going to take to Jerusalem, and that basically what it was going to be for would be to kind of buy them off, to get their approval again. And that's why in the book of Romans he mentions go into Jerusalem, and that he's asking his followers to pray that his efforts have not been in vain, because he was going there and hoping to get the approval of the Jerusalem assembly. And he was basically putting all of his eggs in one basket, because he knew if he did not get this approval, that his ministry would be over, because he was being exposed as a false teacher. And then we know what happened. Paul goes to Jerusalem. James, instead of accepting the bribe, he tells Paul, well, why don't you go to the temple and pay and use this money to pay for the vow for these men that we have. And it was a large amount of money. People have figured it up in the tens of thousands of dollars that it would cost to pay for Paul and all those other people to get that, to pay for that vow at the temple. And so that was James basically redirecting those funds. And not only that, but I think that he was kind of setting Paul up, basically saying, look, we're hearing that you're teaching all these false doctrines and teaching lawlessness, teaching people to forsake the Torah. And so, well, here, to prove that those rumors about you are false, take this money and go and pay the vow of these men in the temple, knowing good and well that if Paul was truly teaching a false doctrine, that when he went to the temple, he was going to be stoned. So it's almost like he's saying, look, if what you're telling us is true, then you should have no worry about going to the temple. And he was setting Paul up. Well, Paul now was caught between a rock and a hard place, because he knew that he could not get their approval if he didn't go and make this offering at the temple, pay for these men's vow. And yet he probably knew what would happen whenever he was seen in the temple. So what was it going to be? Either his ministry is over, or he goes to the temple and hopes for the best. And once we understand that Paul was a Herodian and that his family was very powerful in Judea, then we understand why it was that the Romans rescued Paul from the hands of the crowd. But getting back to the book, see, Mr. Orlando, he really didn't, I don't think he was prepared to actually go and say that James was setting Paul up. He does allude to it, and I think I've got that highlighted later in the book, but he does kind of dance all around whether that offering was accepted or not, and it doesn't appear from my reading that it was, at least from the evidence we have in Acts. So let's back up a little bit. Most, if not all, of his letters were defenses of the central conflict and exposed his innermost thoughts about his mission and himself. The short autobiography Paul gave us in the 2nd chapter of Galatians also reflected these doubts and his effort to win the approval and even the footing with Yeshua's original apostles. So people try and claim that Paul was definitely an apostle, but you can see that even in Paul's epistles, he's totally defending himself. He's constantly defending himself, rather, from these accusations that he's not an apostle. His moments of doubt revealed his strongest reactions and caused his most dramatic decisions. They haunted him, and the reader is forced to ask why. What was the source of his misgivings? Paul's doubts arose mainly from his ongoing conflicts with his Jewish Christian brethren in Jerusalem, conflicts that cast such a shadow on his mission that he was driven to earn his way to support through a collection. One could argue Paul had to buy his apostleship. The collection offers us a tangible plot to map the conflicts we have described above. So, again, this is basically what the thesis of Mr. Orlando's book is that Paul had to buy his apostleship because he was revealed to be teaching a false doctrine. We'll back up on this one. In the end, his ministry was allowed in large part because of the money he provided the mother church, the Bribe. And while no one will argue that this was not without a symbolic meaning of Gentile-Jewish unity, it showed a hesitancy or even an unwillingness on the part of his brethren. Soon after, they completely rejected him again, and so we now know the agreement to the Gentile mission was short-lived. Now, I don't think they accepted his bribe, unless he's talking about the initial agreement that he made with Kepha and James that Paul mentions at the beginning of Galatians. I think there was an early agreement. Then Paul realized he needed to raise some more money to hopefully win their approval again. And when he went back to Jerusalem the last time and gave that money, that they did not accept the money. And I think that's the reason Paul was sent to the temple. And as the book of Acts and tradition would have us believe, in his final days, Paul was left alone to die. How could this have happened? How did a man of such promise become such a tragic figure? This book is an attempt to reconstruct Paul's story, or gospel, if you will, from his letters, using acts and support to demonstrate how a vision of promise would lead to a hopeless prison cell and then, remarkably, a new religion. So, again, I think that some of Mr. Orlando's statements in here did answer some questions for me as I looked at my own understanding of Paul, but I still believe that my understanding that I speak about in my series on what's up with Galatians, I really do think that I have a closer grasp upon what really happened between Paul and the assembly. Of course, everybody always thinks their own opinions are correct, but I will say that some of my understanding did shift a little bit when reading Mr. Orlando's book. I think that he gave it a little bit more of a human understanding of what the conflict was between the central characters in this narrative. This is one of the footnotes. He says, note, this was not the Arab world. These were Nabateans, different from those who are known then and now as Arabs. In fact, they spoke and wrote in a form of Aramaic. Herod the Great's family was from this region and were converted Jews. Paul's use of the term Arabia reflects Roman geographical terminology. Trajan incorporated it into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD when he gave the designation Arabia Petraea. So we'll go here to 52 and see what exactly this footnote was. It says, though he was forceful about his independence, the difficulties of the Arabian desert with his ethnic and religious differences caused Paul to start thinking differently about going it alone. So I believe that this is in reference to Paul when it says that he went into Arabia after seeing his vision of Yeshua, that this area of Arabia that Paul actually went to was not what we think of as Arabia, but this was the origin of the area where Herod the Great lived, in Petra. And so this, again, Mr. Orlando doesn't seem to have this understanding that Paul was a Herodian, but this does actually reinforce my contention that Paul was actually a member of the Herodian family. Says these encouraging skills were likely put to the test when Paul and Barnabas came before the apostles. We know little about the meeting except the apostles wanted to know that Paul's conversion was genuine. So he's talking about Paul's skill as an orator. I guess we could back up another paragraph. Barnabas, like Paul, was a former Pharisee who's now a follower of Yeshua. Now, again, Paul claims to be a Pharisee. Of course, he seems more in line with the Sadducean type of understanding. He was a agent of the Sadducean high priest, and his doctrines seem to follow more of the Sadducean bend and not that of the Pharisees. Paul was all about the temple. They may have been friends in previous lives. Paul's letters describe Barnabas as generous character, this even-tempered personality that was able to move easily among diverse groups. Okay, so these skills he's talking about, he's saying that Barnabas may have had skill in kind of smoothing things over between two separate groups. So he wasn't talking about Paul, he was talking about Barnabas. And then maybe Barnabas kind of acted as a peacekeeper. I do think that a lot of that seems to be speculation from Mr. Orlando. It may or may not be true. But it says Acts 9:27 corroborated the letter's claim that Barnabas took Paul to the apostles in order to vouch for him. With Barnabas, the encourager, at his side, Paul appeared at least to have passed the apostles' initial scrutiny. But once he stepped out from the shadow of Barnabas' reputation, a deep scrutiny must have remained in the holy city from both the Jewish Christians and the Orthodox Jews. So this is what I was speaking about earlier, that maybe this initial meeting, the meeting that Paul talks about in the second chapter of Galatians, maybe it went smoothly because of Barnabas, but then even after the meeting, more questions arose, and that was the reason for the later split, and that was the reason also that Paul now had to raise this money and bring in this sizable donation / bribe to try and buy his apostleship. So this next highlight, it was speaking about Paul's sarcastic comments about the pillars. And I'll read this quote. It says, "From those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. Elohim shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me with the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." So this second chapter of Galatians, this is the meeting that I keep referring to, where it appears that things went well for Paul, but then later there were more questions that arose. Okay. Moreover, Paul's sarcastic references to the acknowledged leaders and pillars of the church in these passages were obviously aimed at the very apostles he met and talked with in his first post-conversion call visit to Jerusalem. So this is something that I've gotten a little bit of flack from. People say that, Paul wasn't being sarcastic. He wasn't talking about the pillars. He wasn't calling them false apostles. But here, Mr. Orlando also recognizes that Paul was being sarcastic when speaking about about James and Cephas and John. Though Paul began his story by stating his independence from the apostles in Jerusalem, he also seemed pressed to acknowledge that not gaining the apostles' approval of his gospel meant running in vain. This pattern of needing but not wanting the support and approval of the Jerusalem church often defined the central conflicts of his life: the outsider born out of time or the abortion. A diaspora Jew who, by virtue of his late conversion, had his legitimacy questioned by those in Jerusalem. To help define the factions, Frank Matra created an imaginary response from Paul's agitators that helped explain another perspective of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. We have a special relationship in Jerusalem. Indeed, Jerusalem is our mother. Therefore, you must heed our gospel, which is rooted in the authentic gospel preached in Jerusalem. That gospel, unlike the gospel proclaimed by Paul, requires Torah and circumcision. Peter, James, and the others, short of Barnabas' intercession, would not have considered listening to the ex-persecutor spouting radical claims based on prophetic vision. We don't know why Paul did not have an extended dialogue with James, but given their positions for years to come, we can speculate that both parties would rather have been avoided their first encounter. And then he has this quote from Hans Betz in his commentary on Galatians. It is clear from other passages that James had a special position in primitive Christianity, which was expressed by his title, the brother of the Lord. Apparently, he was not regarded as an apostle or as one of the 12. The question also arises, why does Paul mention the names of Cephas and James? He most likely does so because of the fact that the opposition derives its authority from these two men. So, again, the opposition was Kepha and James, was Peter and James and John. It wasn't that there was a faction and then that you had Peter, Paul, James, and John on one side, and then this faction of the circumcision on the other. The faction of the circumcision was Peter, James, and John. It wasn't that what the church has been trying to teach us as an excuse. In all of Paul's utterances, there was no stronger statement to show the dividing lines between the original Jewish Christianity and what came to be Pauline Christianity. Proving this conflict, we see it was not only a collision between ideas of faith and works, but also a fundamental question of revelation. The question was, who would interpret the wishes of Yeshua, Paul, or his brother James? So what was his statement? I will ask you one simple question. Did you receive the spirit of Elohim by trying to keep the law or by believing the message of the gospel? Surely you can't be so idiotic to think that a man began a spiritual life in the spirit and then completes it by reverting to outward observances. Has all your painful experience brought you nowhere? I simply cannot believe it of you. Does Elohim, who gives you his spirit and works miracles among you, do these things because you have obeyed the law, because you have believed the gospel? Ask yourselves that. So this is a very liberal translation of Galatians 3:2 through 5. So this is Paul's central thesis. This is the source of the conflict. Paul went further to eliminate even the notion that there were two tracks to the gospel. Yet I say that even if an angel from heaven were to preach to you any other gospel than the one you have heard, may he be damned. So, like I said here in this comment, in one summary, Paul both attacked his opponent's motives and appealed to those tempted to add the law back to his gospel. Those men who are always urging you to be circumcised, who are they after? They want to present a pleasing front to the world. They want to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. For even those who have been circumcised do not themselves keep the law, but they want you circumcised so that you may be able to boast about your submission to their ruling. So people have asked me, do you think that circumcision was originally a requirement? Because my understanding that I got from Kepha is that the law had things added to it. And so I'm asked, is circumcision one of those things that's added? I don't believe it is. I've got a personal experience that indicates to me that it's not added to it, but maybe I'll share that at a different time. But if circumcision was something that was added after the fact, the early assembly would not have called themselves the party of the circumcision. You wouldn't have seen Paul always arguing against circumcision. It's like even Mr. Orlando agrees that Paul is attacking his opponents, and his opponents, of course, were the followers of James, who were demanding that they are circumcised. So all of this seems to indicate, including, and also in addition to that, the testimony of Epiphanius, who says that the Ebionites and all these Jewish Christian groups required circumcision. So it seems to me that circumcision was originally a requirement, that it is something that was from the genuine part of the Torah. But notice that Paul throws this in there, that those who have been circumcised do not even themselves keep the Torah. Well, I think that Paul right now here is taking advantage of the fact that the Jewish Christians understood that there were things added to the Torah that were not part of it originally. And so there were parts of the Torah they wouldn't keep, namely the animal sacrifices. And then Paul's using this doctrine against them to say, well, they don't even keep the law. Why are they trying to make you keep the law? And that may be the source of what Paul was even saying to Kepha. You know, why do you force these people to Judaize when you yourselves don't even live according to the Torah? And I think that this may be what he's talking about, is that they understood that there were things added to the Torah after the fact. Moving on, it says, our idea of Christianity as a universal message that would cross over all boundaries, including ethnic ones, was still Paul's unique aspiration. It was not that the others had changed their minds, but that they'd never believed it. So Christianity was never meant to be this religion for the Gentiles. It was, you know, and by Christianity I mean belief in Yeshua, that it was something intended to remain Jewish. And so in order to, or I guess maybe I should say Israelite. So if you want to be part of the body of Messiah, you have to be part of Israel by becoming part of Israel, by, you know, keeping the Torah, being circumcised, such and so forth. And that's what Kepha says in the Nazarene Acts. He says he is a Jew who chooses to keep the Torah, so that if a Gentile chooses to keep the Torah, he becomes a Jew. So in order to be a follower of Yeshua, a true follower of Yeshua, you should, first of all, keep the Torah. And by keeping the Torah, then you become a Jew or an Israelite or a Hebrew or whatever term you want to use. And that once you become, you know, that status as opposed to Gentile, then you can call yourselves a true believer in Messiah. That it was never meant to be this Gentile versus Jew thing. It was always meant to be only for Jews. Jews being defined as someone who keeps Torah, not someone who is ethnically Jewish or rabbinically Jewish or anything like that. A single gospel as given through a single revelation was a surprise to all but Paul. Geza Verns puts it succinctly: the issue was unforeseen and the solution proposed revolutionary. No one in the Jerusalem church was assumed to be ready and willing to receive Gentiles, nor were they aware that Christ had ordered the gospel to be preached to all the nations, rather the contrary. So that's the reason they didn't support Paul's mission, is because Paul's mission was something that Yeshua never preached about. And they knew that Paul had received a false revelation because he was going contrary to what Yeshua himself had told them. We'll back up a little bit on this one. Paul drew upon the Savior of the Psalms and Isaiah, pondering Christ not only as king, but also as a suffering servant. Paul's suffering, which was anything but meaningless, was for a specific purpose based on an inner revelation gained through Elohim's word, knowledge to be centered on the dying and rising of the Lord Jesus Christ. Paul's newfound knowledge, born from suffering, rendered him able to discern between sound and unsound doctrine. As a result, we see his moving away from Jewish-based prophecy and toward the ideas of the body of Christ based on the revelation of the mystery. By separating prophecy from mystery, the kingdom from the body, believers were free to engage in a universal message without stumbling or causing others to stumble over the doctrine or ethnic differences. So, one of the things Mr. Orlando talks about in the book is that as you look at the order of Paul's different epistles, they get less and less Jewish. He seems to be moving away from prophecy in the Old Testament and toward this new revelation that, you know, Christ had given him, until you get to the book of Romans. In Romans, where Paul says he's preparing to go back to Jerusalem, that's the one that's really kind of pro-Jewish. And the reason would be obvious. I mean, he's getting ready to go and try and make this bribe. He's trying to smooth things over. And so he writes the book of Romans, which is pro-Jewish in a lot of respects, because he knows that the Jerusalem assembly is going to read that letter, so he wants to kind of show, solidarity with them if he's going to be going there and asking them to support his gospel. It's most likely the pseudo-apostles were from Jerusalem. Paul's relationship with those at the temple, those in authority, was a central conflict in his letters, and that meant James, Peter, and John. So again, just like I had said, these pseudo-apostles, these fake apostles, were actually James, Peter, and John. And so Mr. Orlando agrees with that. He says this assumption is backed up by the fact that these apostles appear bearing letters of condemnation. These were common in the ancient world, but it was not standard practice for the mother church in Jerusalem to issue them beyond Judea. As Paul is careful not to identify the source of the letters, we are compelled to ask, who else would send out Jewish apostles to preach a false, according to Paul, gospel mandating circumcision? The answer is that only one man could have sent letters of commendation, willingly or unwillingly, which is James, the Lord's brother. So it's letters of commendation, not condemnation. Sorry, misread that. But these letters in 2 Corinthians, Paul is trying to explain why he doesn't have these letters of commendation. Now, Mr. Orlando says it was not common for the early church to do this, but yet we see it being spoken about in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles and the writings of Clement. So I think it was common practice, and I think it was put in place because of Paul. I think that it was a way to combat Paul's false gospel, and keep us not to accept any teacher unless he has these letters of recommendation. Okay, this is turning into a little bit longer of a presentation than I thought, so I'm going to break it off here, and we'll come back with part 2 in a moment. Thank you. Shalom.